Welcome to Wartime Heroes. This channel is about real courage, about the moments when ordinary men step into extraordinary circumstances and change the course of history forever. Tonight's story isn't about politics. It's not about strategy. It's not even about nations. It's about a young man from Arizona who refused to follow the rules and in doing so became one of the most feared pilots in the sky. When his commander said play it safe, he said watch this. When they told him to stay in formation, he flew straight into enemy territory alone. If you respect that kind of fearless determination, hit that like button. If you believe legends like this deserve to be remembered, make sure to subscribe because this is the story they don't teach in schools, but we tell it here. It was September 1918. The Western Front stretched like a scar across Europe. Above the trenches, death danced on wings of canvas and wire. Pilots climbed into their machines knowing that survival was measured in days, not months. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot was 17 hours of flight time. But there was one American who didn't just survive, he thrived. Frank Luke Jr., just 20 years old, with eyes that burned like desert fire and a temper to match. In 18 days of combat, he would destroy 18 enemy aircraft and balloons. But this isn't just a story about numbers. This is about a rebel who fought his own war in the middle of the Great War. A man who trusted his instincts over orders and paid the ultimate price for his courage. Before the bullets and the blood, before the roar of engines and the crack of machine guns, there was Phoenix, Arizona. Hot, dusty, and as far from the trenches of France as you could imagine. That's where Frank Luke Jr. grew up, the son of German immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. His father worked the copper mines, his mother tended the family. Frank was the middle child, caught between older brothers who followed the rules and younger siblings who looked up to him. Even as a boy, he was different. While other kids played games, Frank built things, model airplanes from scraps of wood and fabric. He'd launch them from the roof of his house, watching them soar over the desert landscape, dreaming of flight. He wasn't the biggest kid, wasn't the strongest, but he had something else. A fire in his belly that wouldn't quit. When the other boys backed down from a challenge, Frank stepped forward. When they said something couldn't be done, he found a way to do it. His teachers called him stubborn. His parents called him determined. His friends called him crazy. All of them were right. In 1917, America entered the Great War. Recruitment posters appeared on every street corner. Young men lined up at enlistment offices, eager to serve their country. Frank was 19, working odd jobs around Phoenix when he saw his first real airplane. A barnstormer had come to town offering rides for $2. Frank didn't have $2. He had 50 cents and a pocket watch his grandfather had given him. The pilot looked at the young man with the intense eyes and the desperate expression. Something about Frank's determination must have impressed him because he took the watch and the coins and gave Frank the ride of his life. 5 minutes in the air changed everything. As Phoenix spread out below him like a map, as the wind whipped through the open cockpit, Frank Luke found his calling. This wasn't just transportation, this was freedom, this was power, this was where he belonged. When they landed, the pilot looked at Frank and said something he'd never forget. Kid, you've got the eyes of a natural pilot. Don't waste that gift. Frank didn't waste it. 3 weeks later, he walked into the Army recruiting station in Phoenix and signed his name on the dotted line. Not for the infantry, not for the artillery. He wanted to fly. The recruiting sergeant looked at this skinny kid from Arizona and almost laughed. Son, do you have any idea how dangerous flying is? Most of these boys don't make it through training. Frank stared back without blinking. I'm not most boys. The journey from Phoenix to flying school was harder than Frank had imagined. First came basic training at Camp Wood in Texas. Marching, drilling, learning to follow orders. For a young man who had spent his life making his own decisions, military discipline was like wearing chains. He clashed with drill sergeants, questioned authority, and earned more punishment detail than anyone in his unit. But when the flying instructors came to select candidates for pilot training, they picked Frank Luke. Something about his intensity, his absolute focus when he talked about flying, convinced them he had what it took. Flight training began at Love Field in Dallas. Here, Frank met his first airplane, a Curtiss JN-4 Jenny. Canvas wings, wire struts, and an engine that sounded like controlled thunder. His first instructor was a veteran pilot named Captain Morrison who had flown reconnaissance missions over the Mexican border. Morrison took one look at Frank's file, saw all the disciplinary notes, and decided this kid needed special attention. Luke, Morrison said on their first day, I've got two kinds of students. The ones who are scared to fly and the ones who think they're invincible. The scared ones usually survive training. The invincible ones usually crash. Which one are you? Frank thought for a moment. Neither, sir. I'm the one who's going to be the best pilot you've ever trained. Morrison almost smiled. Almost. We'll see about that, Arizona. The training was brutal. Ground school in the morning, studying aerodynamics, navigation, engine mechanics. Flight training in the afternoon, learning to take off, land, and everything in between. Many students washed out. Some couldn't handle the technical aspects. Others couldn't overcome their fear of being hundreds of feet in the air with nothing but fabric and wood keeping them aloft. Frank excelled at both, but it wasn't just his natural ability that set him apart. It was his absolute dedication. While other students spent their evenings in town, Frank stayed at the field, studying aircraft manuals by lamplight. He memorized every bolt, every wire, every component of the Jenny. He understood his machine not just as a tool, but as a partner. When other students struggled with certain maneuvers, Frank was already moving on to advanced techniques. Captain Morrison watched this intense young man from Arizona with growing interest. Frank had the technical skills, the natural instincts, and the fearless attitude that made great combat pilots. But he also had something that worried Morrison. Frank didn't just bend rules, he ignored them completely when they didn't make sense to him. During formation flying exercises, Frank would break away to try aerobatics. During navigation training, he'd take unauthorized detours to practice combat maneuvers he'd read about in aviation magazines. Luke, Morrison said after one particularly creative interpretation of flight orders, you've got to learn to follow instructions in combat. Discipline can mean the difference between life and death. Frank looked his instructor in the eye. Sir, with respect, in combat, thinking for yourself can mean the same thing. It was a clash that would define Frank's entire military career. The tension between following orders and following instincts, between being part of a team and being an individual warrior. Both sides had merit. Both sides had costs. Despite his rebellious streak, Frank graduated from flight training with honors. His instructors noted his exceptional flying ability alongside concerns about his attitude toward authority. But there was no question he was ready for the next phase of training. Advanced Combat School at Ellington Field, where he would learn the deadly art of aerial warfare. Here, Frank encountered his first taste of what awaited him in France. Combat maneuvers, gunnery practice, formation tactics. The aircraft were faster, more powerful. The training was more intense. And the instructors were combat veterans who had seen the elephant, men who had flown over the Western Front and lived to tell about it. One of these instructors was Major Harrison, a quiet man with steady hands and eyes that had seen too much. Harrison had shot down 3 German aircraft before being rotated back to training duty. He understood what Frank would face in France, and he was determined to give him every possible advantage. "Luke," Harrison said during their first meeting, "I've read your file. Outstanding pilot, questionable attitude. In France, both of those things will either make you a legend or get you killed in your first week. Which one depends on whether you can learn when to follow orders and when to trust your gut." Frank studied this man who spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had survived what most didn't. "How do you tell the difference, sir?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Experience and luck. Mostly luck. The training at Ellington was unlike anything Frank had experienced. Mock dogfights that left him exhausted and exhilarated. Gunnery runs where he learned to hit targets while pulling 3 Gs in a diving turn. Formation flying that required absolute precision and trust in the men beside him. Frank excelled at the individual skills but struggled with the teamwork aspects. He was always pushing the envelope, always testing limits, always trying to find a better way to do things. During one training exercise, Frank broke formation to pursue a target that the other pilots had missed. He dove alone through simulated anti-aircraft fire, lined up a perfect shot, and scored a direct hit on the practice balloon. When he landed, his squadron commander was waiting for him. "Luke, that was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen a trainee do. You left your wingman, ignored formation discipline, and flew into a kill zone alone." Frank pulled off his flying helmet, his dark hair matted with sweat. "But I got the target, sir. This time, what happens when there are real bullets flying? What happens when your wingman needs you and you're off playing lone wolf?" It was a question that would haunt Frank throughout his career. The balance between individual initiative and team responsibility. Between being a warrior and being a soldier. As winter turned to spring in 1918, Frank completed his advanced training. He was now qualified as a pursuit pilot trained in the deadly art of aerial combat. His final evaluation noted exceptional flying ability, superior marksmanship, and natural leadership qualities. It also noted a tendency toward independent action that required careful management. Frank didn't care about the criticism. He was going to war. The orders came in March 1918. Frank Luke Jr. was assigned to the 27th Aero Squadron, part of the American Expeditionary Force in France. He would be flying the SPAD-30, the fastest fighter aircraft in American service. As he packed his few belongings for the journey across the Atlantic, Frank felt no fear, only anticipation. Everything he had trained for, everything he had dreamed about since that first airplane ride in Phoenix was about to become reality. The voyage to France took 2 weeks aboard a converted passenger liner. Frank spent most of the time studying aircraft recognition charts and tactical manuals. He memorized the silhouettes of German fighters, learned their strengths and weaknesses, studied the tactics that had kept other American pilots alive. But more than anything, he visualized himself in combat, imagining every possible scenario, planning his responses. When the ship finally docked in Brest, France, Frank got his first smell of the war. Smoke from distant artillery, the tang of cordite in the air, the controlled chaos of a military port processing thousands of men and tons of equipment. This wasn't training anymore. This was the real thing. The train ride to the front took another day. Through countryside scarred by 4 years of warfare, past villages reduced to rubble, alongside roads clogged with military traffic. Frank pressed his face to the window, taking in every detail. Somewhere out there, German pilots were flying missions, hunting American aircraft, defending their territory with the same determination that burned in his own chest. The 27th Aero Squadron was based at Rembercourt Aerodrome, about 30 miles behind the front lines. As Frank's transport pulled through the gates, he saw his new home for the first time. Wooden barracks, canvas hangars, and lined up on the flight line. The most beautiful aircraft he had ever seen. SPAD-30s, their fabric wings taut, their engines gleaming, their machine guns loaded and ready for war. Frank's squadron commander was Major Harold Hartney, a Canadian who had transferred to American service. Hartney was a combat veteran with 4 confirmed kills and a reputation for aggressive leadership. He looked at Frank's file, then at the young man standing at attention in front of his desk. "Arizona, huh? Long way from home, Luke." "Yes, sir." "Ready to get to work, sir?" Hartney studied Frank for a moment. "I've got 18 pilots in this squadron. Good men, all of them. Some are veterans with multiple kills. Others are green as grass, fresh from the States. What makes you think you belong here?" Frank met his commander's gaze without flinching. "Because I can fly, sir. And I can fight. We'll see. You'll start with local familiarization flights. Learn the terrain, the patrol routes, the enemy positions. After that, if you prove you can follow orders and work with your squadron mates, you'll get your chance at combat." But Frank Luke wasn't planning to wait for permission. That very night, as he lay on his narrow bunk listening to the distant rumble of artillery, he was already planning his first mission. He had studied the maps, memorized the locations of German observation balloons, calculated flight times and fuel consumption. Tomorrow he would begin his war. What none of them knew, not Hartney, not the other pilots, not Frank himself, was that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. In just 18 days of combat flying, this stubborn kid from Arizona would rewrite the rules of air combat and become a legend that would outlive them all. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Frank Luke Jr. was about to begin his deadly dance with destiny above the killing fields of France. September 12th, 1918. Dawn broke gray and cold over Rembercourt Aerodrome. Frank had been at the squadron for 2 weeks, flying reconnaissance missions, learning the lay of the land. But reconnaissance wasn't what he came to France to do. While other pilots grabbed coffee and complained about the weather, Frank was already in the hangar, running his hands over the fabric skin of his Spad, checking every wire, every strut, every connection. His ground crew, Sergeant Murphy and Private Collins, watched this intense young pilot with growing respect. Most flyers treated their mechanics like servants. Frank treated his like partners. "She's ready to go, Lieutenant," Murphy said, wiping grease from his hands. "Engines running smooth, guns are loaded, fuel tanks topped off." Frank nodded, still focused on his pre-flight inspection. "What's the word on enemy activity?" "Intelligence says there's a German observation balloon about 15 miles northeast. Been directing artillery fire on our positions for 3 days. Command wants it taken down." Frank's eyes lit up. This was what he'd been waiting for. Not another milk-run patrol, not another boring reconnaissance flight. A real target, a chance to strike back. Major Hartney appeared in the hangar doorway, flight gear in hand. "Luke, you're flying wing position today. Stay close, follow my lead, and do exactly what I tell you. These balloon attacks are tricky business. The Germans protect those gas bags with everything they've got." Frank suited up quickly. Leather flying coat, goggles, silk scarf to prevent chafing from the collar. He strapped on his pistol, checked his maps one final time, then climbed into the cockpit of his Spad. The Hispano-Suiza engine coughed to life with a roar that sent vibrations through his entire body. This was it. His first real combat mission. The formation took off just after sunrise. 6 Spads climbing into the gray French sky, their engines synchronized in a deadly harmony. Frank held his position off Hartney's right wing, but every fiber of his being wanted to push forward, to get to the target first, to be the one who brought down that balloon. Frank Luke Jr. burned bright and fast across the skies of France like a comet that refused to fade quietly into the night. From that dusty airfield in Phoenix to the trenches of the Western Front, he proved that sometimes the greatest legends are forged by those who refuse to follow the path others have chosen for them. In 18 days of combat, he didn't just shoot down 18 enemy aircraft and balloons. He rewrote the rules of what one man could accomplish when he trusted his instincts over his orders. Frank paid the ultimate price for his courage. But his legacy lives on in every pilot who dares to push beyond the limits, in every warrior who chooses to lead from the front. This was Frank Luke Jr., a rebel, a hero, a legend. And now his story is yours too. Thank you for watching Wartime Heroes. If this story of raw courage and determination moved you, hit that like button. If you believe heroes like Frank deserve to be remembered, make sure to subscribe. Until next time, fly high, stand tall, and never let anyone tell you the impossible can't be done.